Stevie Wonder. That was the sound of a jogger's voice cutting through Hermann Park on a Saturday afternoon, sharp and cruel, carried on a wind that smelled like cut grass and diesel exhaust from the city beyond the tree line. They didn't know who they were mocking. They didn't know that the woman in the ill-fitting volunteer polo shirt, navy blue, 2 sizes too large, sleeves bunching at her wrists, had held a field hospital together for 16 hours straight while mortar rounds punched through the compound walls around Marja. She was 38 years old and had learned to recognize the sound of incoming fire before she learned to recognize her own face in the mirror anymore. Katie Morrison knelt beside the donation bin near the Hermann Park fountain, her hands arranging medical supplies with the precision of someone assembling a surgical tray. Bandages. Antiseptic wipes. ACE wraps in ascending sizes. A tourniquet coiled like a snake at the bottom of the canvas bag, the kind with the metal windlass she'd been trained to apply in a combat hospital where the floors were concrete and the screaming never stopped. Her fingers trembled slightly as she folded a blood pressure cuff, not from fear, but from the cold numbness that came when her hands had been doing the same task for 6 months straight. Fold. Arrange. Fold. Arrange. The repetition was a prayer she'd learned instead of words. A child approached with a scraped knee, and Katie's entire posture shifted. The trembling stopped. Her spine straightened. She looked up with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing the world could offer. "Hey there," she said, voice steady as a surgeon's laser. "That looks like it hurts. Come sit with me." The boy's mother watched from a distance, relief washing across her face. The way this quiet volunteer moved, no hesitation, no unnecessary questions, just immediate competence, suggested she'd done this 1,000 times. She had. 12 years in field conditions where there were no protocol manuals, just anatomy and physics and the clock ticking toward shock. Katie cleaned the scrape with antiseptic, the sharp chemical smell cutting through the park air. She applied a bandage with gentle pressure, then wrapped an elastic bandage around the knee with the kind of exactness that could only come from training. Not practice. Training. The kind they gave soldiers before sending them downrange. "There," she said. "You're going to be fine. That's going to feel better in about an hour." The boy nodded, and his mother approached with gratitude painted across her face. "Thank you so much. Are you a nurse?" Katie was already standing, already moving back to the donation bin, her answer coming without inflection. "Just a volunteer." The lie came easily now. She'd been telling it for 6 months, ever since her medical discharge had left her with a rank she couldn't use and a skill set the civilian world didn't want to acknowledge. Major Katie Morrison. The title sat in her chest like a stone, unmovable, never spoken aloud. The dog tag shifted against her ribs as she bent to restock the first aid kit. She'd found it 3 weeks ago in this same bin, tangled in a pair of worn work gloves someone had donated. A single tag on a chain that had snapped in half years ago. The metal was smooth from handling, worn through to the base layer, and when she'd picked it up her hands had gone completely still. She hadn't opened it to read the name. Some things were better left in the dark. She'd just placed it against her chest, over her heart, over the scar tissue that ran from her collarbone to the curve of her right shoulder, and left it there. Carried it like a secret. Like a confession. Park director Vincent Ashford watched her from his golf cart parked near the Rose Garden, his eyes tracking her movements with the kind of intensity that had nothing to do with admiration. He was 46, expensive watch catching the afternoon sun, pressed khaki pants that had probably cost more than Katie's entire volunteer uniform. The kind of man who'd never had to take an order, only give them. He'd been running Hermann Park for 7 years, and for 7 years he'd been siphoning money from vendor permits into a personal account with the kind of methodical precision that suggested he'd been doing it for longer than that. Last Saturday, Katie had been standing near the vendor pavilion when he'd pocketed $340 in cash from a food truck permit. She hadn't said anything. She'd just been there, her face completely neutral, her eyes catching his for exactly 2 seconds before she'd looked away. That 2 seconds had been enough. She'd seen the calculation in his expression the moment he'd decided what to do about her presence. "Afternoon, Katie." His voice came across the park grass, pleasant and controlled, the way all predators sound when they are not sure yet if their prey has teeth. She turned, the donated medical supplies momentarily forgotten. She was on her feet, smooth, efficient, no wasted motion. "Afternoon, Mr. Ashford. How are the supplies holding up? Donations been steady?" "Steady enough." Short answers. She'd learned to keep sentences brief, to never volunteer information, to present the smallest possible target. "The bandages go quickly on weekends. People fall." Ashford nodded, stepping down from the golf cart with the kind of careful deliberation that meant he'd already decided something about her. "You've been doing good work out here. People talk about you. The elderly folks especially." Katie didn't respond. She waited, because praise without purpose was a tool, and she'd learned to recognize tools pointed at her chest. "Mrs. Chen came by the office yesterday," Ashford continued, walking closer. "Said you probably saved her husband's life when he had that dizzy spell last month. Said you moved so fast she didn't even see it happening. Like you'd done it 1,000 times. Basic first aid. Nothing special." "Nothing special," he repeated, and the smile that crossed his face was like a wolf showing its teeth. "Not threatening yet. Just showing. What's your background, Katie?" "Before Hermann Park." There it was. The question she'd been waiting for since the moment she'd handed in her volunteer application with her civilian name and no references and a complete absence of history. The question that required an answer. "Healthcare," she said. "Long time ago. Different city. Seattle." The precision of his guess landed like a physical blow, though her face didn't change. She'd mentioned nothing about Seattle. She'd mentioned nothing about anything. But Vincent Ashford was the kind of man who dug, who made calls, who knew people in city systems who owed him favors. His phone buzzed in his pocket. She heard the vibration, watched his jaw tighten with something that looked like satisfaction. "My office got a call from the city auditor this morning," he said, pulling out his phone. "Surprise inspection coming next week. Full financial audit of park operations. Pretty routine stuff, usually." He looked up from the screen, and his eyes were flat now, empty of anything resembling warmth. "But sometimes these audits turn up interesting things. Sometimes they find people who don't quite fit where they're supposed to be." Katie's hands had resumed their task, organizing, arranging, moving with the automatic precision of someone whose body had learned to keep working while her mind processed threat assessment. Threat level, unknown. Escalation, beginning. The room went dead silent except for the water splashing in the fountain behind them, a sound like coins dropping into a well. "I'm not sure what you mean," Katie said, and her voice had dropped an octave without her willing it to happen. That was the problem with training, your body remembered even when your mind tried to forget. "I think you understand perfectly." Ashford's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at it, then back at her. "I think you understand that I'm the director of this park. I think you understand that volunteers serve at my discretion. And I think you understand that people who pay attention to things they shouldn't pay attention to tend to become problems." It wasn't a request. It was a warning dressed up in administrative language, the kind of threat that left no evidence because it never quite became explicit. Katie had heard worse in languages she didn't speak anymore, delivered by men with guns. This was different. This was the civilian version of the same message, and somehow that made it worse. "I should get back to work," Katie said. "Yes, you should." Ashford stepped toward his golf cart, then paused. "You know what I respect about people like you? The ones who keep their heads down. The ones who understand that knowing things and saying things are very different decisions." He settled back into the driver's seat. "I hope you continue to understand that." The golf cart pulled away toward the administrative building, and Katie's hands finally stilled. She looked down at the medical supplies still arranged in perfect order in the canvas bag, then at her palms. They were steady. No trembling. No visible sign of the adrenaline that was moving through her system like electricity through copper wire. The dog tag pressed against her ribs, warm from her body heat. She'd spent 6 months trying to become invisible, trying to convince herself that the major who'd held that field hospital together had ceased to exist. Trying to believe that Katie Morrison was a real person, that the volunteer polo shirt was who she actually was, that the trembling hands were genuine weakness and not just the machinery of her body shutting down adrenaline responses. But Vincent Ashford had just reminded her of something she'd been trying to forget: invisibility only worked until someone decided to look. An elderly man approached with his wife, both of them moving slowly, both of them looking for the medical station. Katie turned to them with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "Let's get your blood pressure checked. Come sit down." Katie was checking vitals on an elderly woman near the main fountain when Ashford's voice crackled over the park-wide PA system. "Would Florence Nightingale please report to the ranger station? Our volunteer Florence needs supervision again." Laughter rippled through the Saturday crowd as heads turned. 50 people watching. Katie's face stayed perfectly still except for one measured breath. The elderly woman patted her hand in sympathy. She folded the blood pressure cuff with precise creases and walked toward the station, her orange safety vest catching the afternoon light like a target. Ashford stood waiting with 2 city rangers flanking him, positioned like this was a formal proceeding. His voice carried loud enough for the dozen people standing in line at the water fountain to hear every word. "I've received complaints about your boundary issues, Florence, following vendors, asking inappropriate questions about permits and cash handling." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a hiss only she could hear. "You're a volunteer with a GED who folds donated scrubs, and I run 6 parks in this city. You think anyone believes your word over mine?" Katie took one measured breath. A single tear escaped before she wiped it without breaking eye contact, her hand steady as a surgical laser. She said, "I've worked for men with actual power, Mr. Ashford. They never needed witnesses." His face went red, but she was already turning away, missing the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. 3 days later, she arrived for her Wednesday shift to find her medical station assignment changed. The children's playground on the far side of the park. Away from the vendor pavilion. Away from weekend crowds. Away from him. The demotion came Friday in the parking lot, Ashford timing it perfectly as the evening shift volunteers gathered for their briefing. 16 volunteers stood in a semicircle, their attention snapping toward his voice like iron filings to a magnet. "Katie Morrison will be transitioning from medical duties to trash collection support. We need reliable people in medical, and Florence here keeps overstepping." He handed her an orange safety vest in front of all of them, his smile sharp as broken glass. Katie's jaw clenched for exactly half a second. She folded her medical volunteer polo with precise creases, placed it on the bench beside her, and pulled on the vest with movements that could have been carved from stone. Her silence somehow carried more weight than any argument could have managed. The murmurs of sympathy rippled through the assembled volunteers like wind through water. But that wasn't the worst part. Tuesday morning, Katie was emptying trash bins near the jogging path when she heard the laughter. 3 runners in expensive athletic gear, moisture-wicking fabric that probably cost more than her monthly rent, circling a bench where a man sat holding a white cane. His hand reached carefully for the water bottle that one jogger kept moving just out of reach. "Come on, Stevie Wonder, you almost had it." The lead jogger, a man in a Rice University shirt, laughed like this was the funniest thing he'd ever done. The second jogger mimicked the veteran's reaching motions, his movements exaggerated and cruel. The blind man's hand found the armrest of the bench, his grip tightening. He didn't respond. Didn't try to explain. Just sat with the absolute stillness of someone who'd learned a long time ago not to give bullies a reaction. Katie moved between them and the bench without deciding to move. Her body just went. She placed herself directly in front of the veteran, her voice carrying that unnaturally calm tone she'd perfected in 20 years of hiding her true self. "Step away from him, or explain to HPD why you're harassing a disabled veteran." The jogger stopped laughing. The lead jogger, still holding the water bottle, snorted. "What's Trash Girl gonna do, report us?" Katie's phone was already out, recording. The veteran's hand found her arm, his grip urgent. "It's fine, I don't want trouble." But she'd already planted her feet like she'd done in Marja, and the joggers were still laughing when the golf cart appeared within 90 seconds. Ashford had been watching her from across the park, waiting for exactly this kind of mistake. He rolled up to the scene, his presence making the air pressure change. The gathered crowd, maybe 24 people now, drawn by the commotion, parted for him like water around a stone. Ashford pulled Katie aside near the fountain, his voice dripping manufactured concern. "I appreciate your passion, Florence, but accosting park patrons isn't in your job description." The veteran tried to speak, but Ashford talked over him, his voice carrying across the plaza. "Sir, I apologize for our volunteer's boundary issues. She's been struggling with appropriate workplace behavior." He produced a termination letter from his clipboard with the ease of someone who'd prepared it days in advance, handing it to Katie in front of 24 onlookers who'd stopped to watch. His voice carried like he was announcing a lottery winner. "Effective immediately, you're removed from all volunteer duties for aggressive behavior toward patrons." Katie took one measured breath, held it for exactly 3 seconds. A single tear escaped before she wiped it without breaking eye contact. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. She said, "I've seen men with actual power, Mr. Ashford. They never needed an audience." She tucked the termination letter into her pocket next to the dog tag on its broken chain, the metal warm against her ribs like a heartbeat. The crowd's murmurs shifted. Not sympathy anymore. Uncertainty. The way people sound when they realize they might have misread the entire situation. Ashford's jaw tightened. His hands opened and closed at his sides. "Security will escort you from the premises." Katie was already walking away, her orange safety vest bright against the park's green grass, and she didn't look back once. The rubber soles of her shoes squeaked against the fountain's wet tile as she passed it, the only sound she made. The veteran called after her, his voice carrying something that wasn't gratitude, something heavier, but she kept walking toward the parking lot where her truck sat waiting like a faithful dog. She sat in the driver's seat for 17 minutes without starting the engine. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the exact position they'd taught her at Fort Sam Houston 18 years ago. The dog tag hung against her ribs, the metal no longer cold. Her breathing stayed steady. Her vision stayed clear. She'd been trained for extraction. She'd been trained for worse than this. What she hadn't been trained for was the weight of invisibility, the particular exhaustion of pretending to be smaller than she actually was. Of folding her medical volunteer polo and accepting a demotion. Of watching a veteran get mocked and not using everything she knew to stop it. And then her phone rang. The number was one she hadn't seen in 6 months. Army Medical Command. Her discharge medical officer was calling, and the only reason he ever called was when something official needed signing. Katie's thumb hovered over the answer button for exactly 2 seconds before she pressed it. His voice came through with military precision. "Major Morrison, I'm requesting your presence at Seattle General Hospital tonight. There's been a development." The line went dead. No details. No explanation. Just coordinates and a timestamp and the implicit understanding that this wasn't a request. She stared through the windshield at the park she'd been volunteering at for 6 months. At the bench where the veteran had Saturday. At the fountain where Ashford had humiliated her in front of 24 witnesses who would testify that she'd been the aggressive one, that she'd accosted park patrons, that she'd overstepped. The termination letter sat on the passenger seat, official letterhead and everything, the kind of thing that would prevent her from volunteering anywhere in the city. True class is what you do when the lights go out. Katie started the truck and pulled out of Hermann Park for what she had no way of knowing would be the last time anyone called her just a volunteer nurse. The fountain water caught the afternoon light as Vincent Ashford emerged from the administrative building, the termination letter crisp in his hands. He moved like a man who'd rehearsed this moment, his pace deliberate, his expression calculated to appear regretful. The crowd near the fountain had grown, a dozen people scattered across the benches and walking paths, the kind of ambient audience a power player always finds useful. Katie stood 20 yards away, her orange volunteer vest bright against the park's green backdrop, when Ashford called out her name. Not requested. Called. The volume of his voice made people turn the way he wanted them to. He approached with the measured steps of someone performing concern, his jaw arranged into something that might pass for compassion if you weren't watching his eyes. "Katie Morrison," he said, his voice carrying across the stone plaza like a public announcement. "As park director, I need to inform everyone here that our volunteer nurse is being removed from park medical duties effective immediately." He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He didn't offer privacy. The audience was the point. Due to serious boundary issues with patrons, repeated violations of volunteer protocol, and inappropriate physical contact, we can no longer maintain her in a position of trust. The crowd shifted. A woman in running clothes exchanged a glance with her companion. An elderly man on the nearest bench straightened, his expression sharpening with interest, the kind of attention that feeds on public humiliation, the oldest currency in human interaction. Katie took one measured breath. The kind of breath that costs everything to take quietly, that requires 20 years of training to keep behind locked teeth. She extended her hand and accepted the letter Ashford offered, her fingers steady as surgical steel. The paper felt like tissue in her grip, 20 years of volunteer work condensed into a single sheet stamped with official letterhead and the weight of a man's desperation. Their eyes met. Ashford expected several things in that moment: tears, trembling, the dissolution of composure that would validate his narrative. What he got instead was something far more dangerous: clarity. A single tear escaped Katie's left eye, the kind of tear that comes not from breaking but from a profound understanding of something true. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that the crowd had to lean in to hear it. "I've seen men with actual power, Mr. Ashford," she said, the words measured like controlled medication. "They never needed an audience." The silence that followed wasn't absence of sound, it was the presence of weight. The fluorescent hum of park lights seemed louder. A distant siren wailed toward the freeway. Ashford's face reddened, his jaw clenching as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered in public, that his theatrical removal had somehow become his own exposure. He turned away without responding, his shoulders stiff with the kind of anger that comes from losing the narrative to someone who'd barely spoken. Katie folded the termination letter into quarters and slipped it into her vest pocket, where it rested beside the dog tag on its broken chain, the metal warm against her ribs, a weight she'd carried long enough that its absence would feel like floating. The crowd dispersed, their appetite for spectacle sated but unsatisfied, the kind of public moment that raises more questions than it answers. She remained by the fountain for another 3 minutes, watching the water recirculate, the way it fell and returned and fell again, finding its rhythm despite the disruption. 20 minutes later, the blind veteran was alone on the concrete path near the tree line, his weathered cane beside him on the bench, his breathing steady and present. Katie had moved away from the fountain, her orange vest now crumpled in her hands. She'd removed it the moment Ashford disappeared, the fabric still warm from her body. She was folding it deliberately, preparing to place it in the donation bin where she'd found it 6 months ago when she was rebuilding herself from nothing, when talking about her past felt like swallowing glass. The vest was synthetic, quick-drying, practical. It had never belonged to her anyway. The veteran's body went rigid first, not gradual, not progressive, but absolute. His spine arched against the bench like something invisible was pulling him upward, his mouth opening in a silent scream. The seizure hit next, violent and complete, his limbs moving in patterns that had no relation to conscious control. His body pitched forward off the bench, and his head caught the concrete corner with a sound like a dropped melon, wet and final. Katie's orange vest fell. The 3 joggers who'd mocked him hours earlier were back, running the same loop, and they stopped in perfect synchronization. One of them raised his phone before he raised his voice, the camera already recording when the screaming started. A woman on the adjacent path shouted for someone to call 911. An older man stood frozen halfway between the bench and the path, his hand pressed to his chest. The veteran's body convulsed again, his breathing shallow and irregular, his lips already taking on that characteristic blue tint that meant oxygen deprivation was already calculating his margin. Ashford's radio crackled, he kept it clipped to his belt, a constant reminder that he held authority in this space. He was 50 yards away, near the administrative office, and he saw the commotion immediately. His hand went to his radio, and his voice came out sharp and practiced, the tone of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them followed. "Medical emergency at the fountain, I need an ambulance now," he barked into the radio, his voice cutting through the crowd noise like a knife. His eyes found Katie in the same moment she moved, her body transitioning from standing to running without any apparent thought between them. "That patient is no longer your responsibility. Don't you dare touch him, you're terminated, you have no authority here." But Katie was already kneeling beside the veteran's convulsing body, her hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this under mortar fire, who'd stabilized airway passages while rounds impacted concrete around her. Her fingers found his pulse point, strong but rapid, the rhythm of a system under extreme stress. She tilted his head back carefully, opening his airway while his body continued to seize, the movements violent and uncontrolled. His lips were already purple, his tongue beginning to swell, his breathing reduced to shallow gasps that weren't delivering any oxygen at all. The crowd pressed closer, a woman shouting about calling 911 even though it was already called, a man asking if anyone knew CPR, someone's phone light illuminating the veteran's face like a stage effect. The seizure lasted another 12 seconds, then stopped abruptly, his body going limp against the concrete. But his breathing didn't restart. The absence of respiration was louder than all the crowd noise combined, that terrible silence where breath should be, that void where life should continue. Ashford grabbed Katie's shoulder, his grip aggressive, his voice escalating into something that resembled panic. "I said step away, that's an order. You have no medical authority here, you're trespassing." Katie's fingers found the scars on the veteran's neck, shrapnel wounds, the pattern unmistakable, the kind she'd seen in Marja, Afghanistan, the kind she'd treated while bullets punched through corrugated metal walls and the smell of cordite mixed with blood. She shrugged Ashford off without looking, her hand reaching down to her ankle where the combat knife still rode in its sheath after 20 years, the weight so familiar her body compensated for it automatically. The blade was 4 inches of surgical steel, designed for field emergency procedures, designed for moments exactly like this one when the margin between survival and death was measured in seconds. The ambulance dispatcher's voice crackled over Ashford's radio, 12-minute ETA, traffic on Memorial Drive, all units responding but we're looking at 10 to 12 minutes minimum. 4 minutes to brain damage. 8 to death. Katie's hand closed on the knife handle. "I've got you, brother," she whispered to the unconscious veteran, her voice dropping to something only he could hear if he could hear at all. "Just like Marja." Ashford saw the blade and started screaming, not words at first, just sounds, the kind of alarm that comes from witnessing something that doesn't fit his understanding of reality. His voice found language quickly enough. "She has a weapon. She's attacking the patient. Call the police, she's got a knife." His radio came alive with crosstalk, confusion, multiple voices asking for clarification. Katie was already cutting the veteran's shirt open, her fingers counting ribs with terrifying precision, finding the landmarks her body remembered even if her mind had tried to forget them. The combat knife moved with purpose, not aggression, a medical instrument in the hands of someone trained to use it as one. The crowd went silent. Even the joggers with their phones stepped back, the reality of what they were witnessing too large to process through a camera lens. The veteran's chest was already opening under her hands. The veteran's chest rose with a gasping breath as the ambulance sirens finally wailed into the parking lot, and Ashford seized Katie's shoulder the moment the EMTs took over, his fingers digging into her scrubs with the desperation of a man watching his leverage slip away. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull back. His screaming started before they'd even transferred the gurney, his voice cracking with a rage that sounded almost panicked. She attacked him. She assaulted a park visitor with a deadly weapon. Katie's hands were crimson to the wrists, the veteran's blood still warm on her skin, and she let Ashford drag her toward the ranger station without resistance. 2 HPD officers were already pulling into the parking lot, lights cutting through the afternoon heat, and Ashford was gesturing widely at Katie's blood-covered hands, at the combat knife lying on the concrete where she'd left it after the last rib compression. "I want her arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. Now." The lead officer, a woman in her 50s with the kind of weathered competence that comes from 20 years in a uniform, approached with her hand resting on her duty belt. She wasn't rushing. She was observing. Katie caught that detail, the slight pause in her step, the way her eyes tracked from the knife to Katie's hands to the blood pooling on the path in the shape of a life saved. We're going to need you to step back and let us assess the scene. Ashford stepped back. He did everything Ashford did, performed authority without possessing it. His voice dropped an octave, became almost reasonable, which was somehow worse than the screaming. She's a volunteer with no medical credentials. She used a concealed knife on a park visitor without consent. That's assault, that's battery, that's reckless endangerment. Inside the ranger station, a 12-by-12 room that smelled like old coffee and the kind of desperation that comes from a man running out of moves, Ashford confiscated the volunteer badge with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for dishonorably discharged soldiers. He placed it on the metal desk between them like evidence in a courtroom. Then the medical bag, the canvas satchel she'd filled with gauze and tourniquets and morphine syringes, all purchased on a volunteer nurse's budget, all packed with the precision of someone who understood that the next person bleeding might be a child. He photographed her driver's license with his cell phone, his hand shaking slightly. Rage, maybe. Or fear. Katie was beginning to understand that Ashford's violence was always the second emotion, never the first. You are permanently banned from all Houston parks. All of them. This is official. This is documented. He gestured to the two officers standing in the doorway, men in their 30s with the slack posture of people who'd already figured out what happened out there on the concrete. If you return to any city park, you will be arrested for trespassing on municipal property. Do you understand me? Katie said nothing. The officers exchanged a look that lasted exactly 2 seconds and contained an entire conversation. The younger one, maybe 35, cleared his throat. Sir, from what we're seeing here, that individual on the gurney would be deceased if she committed a crime. Document it. Ashford's voice had taken on the thin quality of someone running entirely on institutional authority and the hope that volume could substitute for substance. I don't care if she saved his life. I don't care if she saved 50 lives. She violated park protocol, she performed and sanctioned medical procedures, she carried a concealed weapon on municipal property, and I want her charged. The female officer nodded slowly, the kind of nod that conveyed zero agreement but complete comprehension of Ashford's official request for documentation. Katie turned toward the doorway. Movement, not escape. Just the simplest gesture of a person ready to walk out of this room and continue existing. Ashford grabbed her wrist, his grip weak compared to the strength she could summon if she chose to, which she didn't, which she wouldn't, which was the point of every bit of control she'd ever learned under mortar fire. We're not finished here. She met his eyes. Just that. No anger. No defiance. Just the flat gaze of someone who'd watched men die in far worse circumstances than this small room and this small man. His scars are from Marja, 2010. Shrapnel pattern, close-range IED. Her voice dropped into the register she'd trained to use in operating theaters. Soft. Absolute. You would have let him die to protect yourself. Ashford's jaw tightened. The female officer closed her eyes for one long moment, as if absorbing information she suddenly didn't want to know. The younger officer actually looked away, toward the window where the park stretched out beyond them, indifferent to the drama unfolding inside this room. Get her out of here. Ashford released her wrist. Now. The parking lot was nearly empty by the time Katie walked through it, just a few stragglers in the distance and the ambulance already pulling away from the bay, siren silent, the veteran stable, breathing, his heart back to a rhythm that made sense. She could hear the rotor wash of a helicopter in the distance, though she didn't know why there would be a helicopter yet. She had no way of knowing that something larger was already in motion, that the phone call had already been made, that someone in Seattle had already been contacted by someone in Houston. She walked to the donation bin where she'd found the volunteer polo shirt 6 months ago when she'd been rebuilding her civilian life after her medical discharge, when talking about her past still felt like swallowing glass, when the only way forward felt like burying every skill that had kept her alive for 12 years. The shirt was orange safety vest color, the kind that made you visible from every angle, the kind that announced your presence whether you wanted to be visible or not. She folded it now with the same precision she'd once used for her dress uniform. Sharp creases. Perfect corners. The kind of control that substituted for other expressions of grief. Her hands had begun to dry, the veteran's blood turning to rust-colored stains on her wrists, and she placed the folded shirt in the bin, not hidden, not crumpled, just placed there like a piece of evidence someone might want to examine later. The dog tag was still there under her shirt, warm against her ribs, the chain still broken from 3 years ago. She touched it once through the fabric, a gesture that looked like nothing but contained everything, and then she stood in the parking lot of Hermann Park with her head slightly tilted and her eyes closed and the afternoon light turning everything gold. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the sound of an incoming call, a phone ringing somewhere in her bag, a voice that would change everything. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened when she answered. His hand found her face before his eyes opened. Muscle memory. 20 years of holding on to a voice in the dark, and now that voice belonged to the woman kneeling beside his stretcher in the ambulance bay, her scrub soaked with his blood, her face inches from his sightless gaze. His fingers traced her cheekbone like reading Braille, like the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. One word escaped his lips, fractured and certain, phantom. The EMT's hands froze on the clipboard. The pen dropped. It clattered against the tile floor with a sound that echoed through the entire bay, loud enough to pull every head in the ambulance wing toward them. The crowd from the park, the joggers, the onlookers, Vincent Ashford standing at the edge of the chaos with his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air, all of them stopped moving. The stretcher wheel squeaked as the medical team shifted backward, giving space they didn't understand they were giving. The EMT's voice shook when she read from the patient file, her eyes locked on Katie's blood-stained face, Lieutenant Marcus Chen, Navy SEAL. She swallowed. Her voice climbed half an octave. He's got your name listed as save contact. Your actual name. Major Catherine Morrison. Katie didn't move. Didn't blink. Her finger stayed on Marcus's shoulder, steady as surgical steel, while the ambulance bay held its breath. An older man in a faded seal trident cap pushed through the crowd, his boots striking the concrete with purpose. His presence moved through the space like a tank idling in a garage, heavy, controlled, impossible to ignore. When he spoke, his voice cut through the chaos with the precision of someone used to giving orders that changed lives. Major Morrison received 2 silver stars and a Purple Heart for Marja. She held a field hospital alone for 16 hours after the compound was overrun. He paused, letting that statement settle into the skin of everyone watching. That was 20 years ago. She was 19 years old. The 3 joggers stood frozen against the far wall, their phones still in their hands, their faces drained of color. One of them, the one who'd called Marcus Stevie Wonder, took a step backward, as if distance could change what they'd witnessed in the park, what they were witnessing now. Vincent Ashford's jaw worked silently. He reached for his radio, his hand trembling in a way Katie's never did. Before he could speak, before he could even press the button, 2 figures emerged from an unmarked sedan parked at the ambulance bay entrance. FBI badges caught the fluorescent light like teeth. The agent on the left held up a file thick as a novel, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority. Vincent Ashford, you're under arrest for embezzlement, attempted evidence tampering, and falsifying federal veteran service records in the park database. Ashford's face went the color of old bone. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The second agent was already moving toward him with handcuffs that clicked like a final sentence. They walked him past Marcus's stretcher. Past Katie with her hand resting on the veteran's shoulder. Past the joggers with their heads down and shame written across their faces like scars. The handcuffs caught the light as Ashford passed, and for a moment, just a moment, his eyes met Katie's. He'd been looking for weakness that entire time and had never learned to recognize strength when it was standing right in front of him, wearing scrubs and carrying the weight of Marja in every breath. The paramedics wheeled Marcus into the bay, and Katie moved with him, her movements flowing like muscle memory returning to its rightful place. She wasn't a volunteer anymore. She wasn't just a nurse. The transformation was complete, and everyone in that ambulance wing could feel it in the air pressure change, in the way people automatically stepped aside when she moved, in the authority that had been there all along, just waiting for someone to finally see it. The next hours dissolved into the controlled chaos of a Navy SEAL's recovery. Katie didn't sleep. Didn't sit. She stood watch over Marcus's bed through the night while hospital staff moved around her with a new kind of deference, the kind you give to someone whose credentials aren't written on a badge but earned in blood and fire. A cardiologist entered the room at 2:56 a.m. and took one look at the way Katie was monitoring the cardiac monitor, the subtle shifts in her stance, the precision of her attention, and didn't bother introducing himself. He simply nodded and stepped back. By dawn, 3 military police officers were standing outside Marcus's room. By noon, a Navy Rear Admiral had arrived at Seattle General. By evening, the local news stations were camped outside the hospital gates, cameras rolling as Marcus described how Major Morrison had saved his life twice, once in Marja when he was 8 years old, caught in crossfire, bleeding out in a burning vehicle, and again today on the concrete park path where she'd split his ribs open to restart his heart. A woman Marine with 50,000 followers streamed the entire story across social media, how Phantom was the legend whispered about in Special Forces units, the surgeon who'd refused evacuation during the Marja siege, who'd performed impossible surgeries while the compound burned around her. The story spread like fire across the internet. Veterans groups shared it. Military subreddits exploded with confirmations from former operators who'd heard the Phantom stories for 2 decades, never knowing the legend's civilian name. Houston's mayor called a press conference by evening. An apology. An offer. Chief Medical Officer for Houston Parks, effective immediately, with a mandate to train first responders in emergency medicine. The FBI agent appeared on the news explaining Ashford's 18-month scheme, nearly $200,000 skimmed from vendor permits, and when Katie had witnessed a cash transaction, he'd begun a systematic campaign to discredit and remove her from the park before she could report him to authorities. 6 months later, Marcus walked Katie through the newly renamed Morrison Medical Center at Hermann Park, where her field surgery techniques were being taught to park rangers across the city. The vendor pavilion now bore a plaque explaining how one veteran's courage had exposed corruption. The fountain where she'd been terminated now surrounded by benches dedicated to Marja survivors. They passed the community center on their evening walk, and Marcus paused outside the glass doors. Through them, visible in the lobby's harsh fluorescent light, was Vincent Ashford in a security guard uniform, examining an ID card from a veteran entering the Thursday night gathering. His shoulders were hunched. His eyes were empty. The only job his record allowed was security guard at the very place whose funds he'd stolen. Katie nodded once, her fingers touching the dog tag on its new chain, the metal no longer broken, the clasp finally whole. Marcus squeezed her shoulder, understanding without words what needed no explanation. True class is what you do when the lights go out. And Ashford's had gone out completely, replaced by the endless grey shift of checking IDs at a door where veterans walked past his desk every single week, seeing the memorial wall inside that bore her photograph, understanding exactly what his choices had cost. Katie turned away from the glass. Turned away from the man who tried to erase her and discovered too late that erasing sunlight doesn't make the sun disappear, it just reveals which direction the darkness is coming from. She kept walking with Marcus beside her, 2 warriors moving through the Houston evening like they always had, forward, steady, unbroken. Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'm curious, comment below and tell us if you're watching this alone or with family. Now let's see how this unfolds.